realm niya. But he was worried about Lanao because he knew that the Spaniards would be coming to Lanao because that was part of the treaty. So after consolidating his realm here in Cotabato and Sabuayan, finally, the people of Buayan, the chiefs of Buayan, accepted him as the sovereign. He went to Lanao 7 years after the signing of the Lopez Kudarat Treaty. This was in 1652. It was a wise move on his part because he was hitting many birds with one stone. First, yung treaty with the Spaniards gave him the opportunity, the space and time for him to consolidate his realm dito sa Maguindanao. Secondly, the chiefs of Lanao, Northern Lanao, ayaw magpailalim sa kanya. So, ginawa niya ito para, the same manner that what he did to the people of Buayan, to the chiefs of Buayan, mapailalim sila sa kanyang sultanate so that he could effectively fight the Spaniard in a united realm. That was September of 1652. No? When the chiefs learned that he was coming, binigyan siya ng malaking piyesta. He told them, sabi niya, the Spaniards are coming. You have to fight the Spaniards. And that was when the chiefs, they protested. They rejected his offer na hindi namin kakalabanin ng mga Espanyol kasi wala naman sila rito. That was when he made that speech of his, that famous speech.
In his famous speech exhorting the Maranao datus and sultans of Lake Lanao to carry on the fight, declared jihad against the Spanish invaders.
Kayong mga Tagalawa, na sadya lang nakakalimot sa inyong sinaunang kalayaan ay tuluyan lang nagpasakop sa mga Kastila. Ang inyong pagsuko ay lantarang kahangalan. Hindi ninyo lubos na nauunawaan ang kalakip ng inyong pagsuko. Ipinagbibili ninyo ang inyong sarili para magpaalitin para sa benepisyo lamang ng mga dayuhang ito. Kung kayo ay mas mahina ang loob kaysa sa kanila, asahan ninyo ang katulad na pagtrato. Kayo, tulad nila, sa ayaw nyo at sa gusto ay magiging tagasagwan. Tulad ng kanilang ginagawa, kayo ay magbubuno ng braso sa kanilang pagawaan ng mga barko at magtatrabaho ng walang humpay sa hindi inyong pampublikong gawain. Matitikman ninyo ang pinakamasiging pagtrato habang naninilbi ang alipin. Magpakatatag kayo. Hayaan ninyong tulungan ko kayong lumaban. Aking ipinapangako, buong puwersa ng aking sultanato ay ipagtatanggol kayo.
Sultan, paano naman ang aming mga ani? Tama.
Eh ano naman kung manaig ang mga Kastila sa umpisa? Hindi ba't iyan ay katumbas lamang ng isang taong ani? Mas matimbang ba ang halagang yan? Para ipagpalit sa panghabang buhay na kalayaan?
The Maranaos went down to Iligan, where the Spaniards were already preparing for the invasion. They attacked the Spaniards doon. So that was the beginning of the resistance of the people of Lanao because of that speech made by Sultan Kudarat.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Sultan Kudarat's period was the golden age of Islamic jihad against the foreign aggression, and he became the symbol of the unconquered Bangsamoro status quo until the present period. Sultan Kudarat died at the old age of 90 in 1671.
Through that speech that you referred to, exhort the Maranaos to resist Spain, to a point that is why the Spaniards made that policy of isolation, because the Maranaos resisted after Kudarat made that speech.
In 1751, Spain passed a royal decree known as the privateer system, which marked the beginning of the bloodiest period in the history of the Moro-Spanish War. The decree provided for the encouragement and enlistment of private individuals to organize expeditions against the Moros, similar to the present Ilaga, Kafgu, CVO, and other paramilitary groups. The incentives were tempting and rewarding. It stipulated the total extermination of the Moros, burning of everything combustible that they owned, and the desolation of all crops and farmlands. Criminals who enlisted were granted unconditional pardon, and all enlistees were exempted from paying tribute and were entitled to 4/5 of the booty. Thousands enlisted for the mercenary expeditions. As anticipated, the results were quick and bloody. On February 27, 1851, Spain launched a massive assault in Jolo, employing a fleet of 3 steamboats, 2 gunboats, 9 transports, 21 barangays, and other boats of different sizes. The attacking forces were composed of 142 officers, 2,876 men, and about 1,000 native volunteers. On the defenders' side were about 10,000 Moro warriors. Jolo was bombarded first, and then ground assaults followed. In the ensuing fighting, the Spaniards reported 34 dead, and the Moros 300. Jolo was razed to the ground. This infamous event later occurred again in February the 7th, 1974, when the Philippine government forces burned Jolo to the ground while fighting the Moro National Liberation Front. It has cost estimated innocent Muslim lives of 20,000 due to air, land, and sea bombardment. In a bid to break all forms of resistance and to settle once and for all the issue of sovereignty over the Moros, Spain launched on February the 21st, 1876, what became known as the final Jolo campaign. Governor-General Jose Melcampo personally led the campaign, involving 9,000 troops, 10 steamboats, 11 gunboats, and 11 transports. Public approval, especially on the issue of religious enmity, was carefully sought to support the campaign. In the forefront of this campaign were the friars of the various denominations: Recollects, Jesuits, Dominicans, and Augustinians. Together they heralded, "The war in Jolo is now a just war, a holy war in the name of religion," or "War without quarters or rest for the wicked sons of the Quran, war to the death with blood and fire." One kota after another fell in intense and bloody fighting and was put to the torch. In the face of these assaults, the Sultan, warriors, and retainers retired to the interior to fight another day. The campaign of Governor-General Jose Melcampo weakened the capability of the Sulu Sultanate to retaliate against Spain. This eventually paved the way for the signing of a treaty with the Spanish crown in July 22, 1878, making the whole of Sulu a protectorate of Spain.
We call this sometimes Spanish Sultanate of Sulu Treaty of Peace of 1878. And meron tayong mga around four basic features of these treaties. Number one, through the treaty itself, I'm talking of the Treaty of Peace of 1878, Spain was allowed by the Sultanate of Sulu to build garrison, small garrison, covering about 15 acres in Jolo town itself. In Jolo. So they were able to build within, but only building, and they had people there in the area, but they were not able to go out of the fort, out of the camp, out of the garrison itself. Okay, so basically the entire Jolo was still under the effective control of the Sultanate of Sulu. That's the first provision. The second feature of the Treaty of Peace of 1878 was Jolo will now be a protectorate state of Spain, which means to say that the protection, the aid, and support of the Sultan of Sulu is now in the hands, or are now in the hands of the Spanish authorities. And the third one, there was payment to the Sultan of Sulu and his datus, ranging from 250 to 11,500 Mexican pesos annually.
In 1861, Spain built a garrison in Cotabato and later became the capital of Mindanao. But after a fire and earthquake hit Cotabato the following year, the capital was returned to Zamboanga. In 1888, Governor-General Emilio Terrero was replaced by Governor-General Valeriano Weyler. Instead of pursuing the military campaign against Dato Uto of Maguindanao, the new governor trained his attention on the Iranuns and Maranaos. In April 1891, Spanish troops reoccupied Parang, Baras, and Malabang in Lanao. Thrown into action in this attack against the Maranaos were 1,242 officers and men. Fierce encounters followed, especially in the kota commanded by Datu Amay Pakpak. In September of the same year, the campaign was terminated without conquering the Lake Moros. In March 1894, even after Governor-General Weyler had left for Manila, the 112 Spaniards pursued the campaign without let-up. Pantan, near Marawi, was occupied. The datus of Taraca, Ramain, Masyu, and Lumbatan felt threatened, and consequently they cooperated to fortify their positions around the Agus River. In the book entitled Bangsamoro, A Nation Under Endless Tyranny, Salah Jubair mentioned that this was the state of affairs during the last years of the Spanish presence in Mindanao and Sulu. Her entire firepower, resources, and manpower were all utilized to subjugate Mindanao and Sulu. And the Moros were still on their feet, not on their knees. As a fitting tribute to their gallantry and determination to resist even against formidable odds, history has appropriately referred to the Moros as the unconquered.
Ako po ay naniniwala na talagang hindi ho nakungkira mga Moros na mga Espanyol, and that is more on the physical side to it. If we examine, kung titingnan natin ang history, ang effective lang na nakontrol ng mga Espanyol yung ilalim ng fortification nila at saka yung mga settlement nila. Aside from that, yung lahat na nasa labas kontrolado na ng mga Moro, either in Sulu, in Cotabato Valley, and even in Lanao. So yun, hindi pagkakungkir ng mga Moro, it's more physical. And physically, I think that's the most effective and most clear evidence that outside of the fort and fortification of the Spaniards, the Moros were ruling the day. And aside from that, Islam as a religion of the Moros was still intact up to the last Spaniards left the islands of Mindanao and Sulu. And even the custom and tradition of the Moros were safely intact. Nasa atin pa rin. So, physically, culturally, in terms of religion, in terms of fighting spirit of the Moros were really unconquered by the Spaniards.
Spain came to this peaceful Islamic land not much for the cross. In most instances, as the facts of her actuations were gradually exposed, religion was merely used to justify what otherwise was a greedy lust for worldly gain and glory. Spain had firmly planted the cross in the Philippines and was no less successful in sowing the seeds of hatred and animosities between the Moros and the Indios.
Well, the other legacy, although in the reverse psychology, is aside from planting the seed of hatred and animosity, biases, prejudices between the Moros and the Christians or the Indios, the bonds of capable, brave Spanish generals were still buried in the souls of Mindanao and Sulu. So these are the other legacies, aside from the hatred, animosity planted by the Spaniards between the Moros and the Christianized natives. And thirdly, fourth pillar is there in Zamboanga City. Until today, it still stands. So that's another legacy of the Spaniards when they were here in Mindanao. And that goes to show that despite the presence of the Spaniards in Mindanao, Islam is still the predominant religion among the Muslims. And the Muslims, as I said earlier, were never conquered by the Spaniards.
Even if the 39 Christianized natives absorbed the greater part of the misfortune that befell the entire inhabitants of Luzon and the Visayas, this was a consequence of collaboration, even if they did this against their wishes.
Among the Moros, there were 13 ethno-linguistic tribes. 13. I would not mention the tribes. We know that very clearly. But of the Christianized natives, there are 39 ethno-linguistic tribes: the Tagalogs, the Kapampangan, the Ilocanos, the Ilonggos, the Cebuanos, so on and so forth. As to whether there are collaborators among the Muslims, well, it's more of not in the strict sense of the word. Generally, there were no collaborators among the Muslims.
The long list of Spanish invasions in Mindanao and Sulu showed the participations of thousands of these natives, and their racial brothers, the Moros, found it almost impossible to discriminate the proselytized subjects from the colonial masters. Both were one in creating havoc in Mindanao and Sulu. On February the 25th, 1898, America declared war on Spain after the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana, Cuba. Admiral George Dewey was ordered to proceed to Manila to attack the Spanish Armada under Admiral Patricio Montojo. On May 1st, 1898, the Battle of Manila Bay began with the Filipino revolutionaries allied with the Americans defeated the Spanish forces until on June 12, 1898, after the last Spanish soldier had surrendered. General Emilio Aguinaldo miscalculated his declaration of Philippine independence in Kawit, Cavite, without knowing the real motives of the Americans. If Aguinaldo did not really misread the American intention, but deliberately played a calculated game, then he had blundered. The Americans never had the slightest intention of recognizing his Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, American troops began to occupy strategic areas vacated or surrendered to them by the retreating Spaniards, to the exclusion of the Filipino revolutionaries. As soon as they had gained enough strategic grounds, the Americans intentionally provoked the Filipinos into a shooting war which set off the start of the Filipino-American War. At the onset, the Filipinos were made to believe that the Americans came to help to liberate their lands from the Spaniards, after which they would become an independent nation. Untrue to their words, the Americans did not really come to liberate the Philippines for the Filipinos, but to acquire a colony in the furtherance of their own imperialist scheme. The Treaty of Paris of 1898 was an agreement that resulted in the Spanish Empire surrendering control of Cuba and ceding Puerto Rico, parts of the Spanish West Indies, the island of Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The treaty was signed on December 10th, 1898, and ended the Spanish-American War. The Treaty of Paris came into effect on April the 11th, 1899, when the documents of ratification were exchanged.
The Treaty of Paris was signed, ceding not only Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, but including the Philippines for a sum of $20 million US.
Knowing that there is a very strong sultanate in that area. But upon the coming of the Americans with the Treaty of Paris, the Americans slowly started to come down to the southern islands and tried to enter into the Sulu archipelago.
On the eve of the signing of the Kiram-Bates Agreement, there were three hard postulates that were molesting the minds of the Americans. There was still 34,000 armed Moros in the Moro country, and the various islands were in such a dangerous condition that no place could be safe for outsiders. The American occupation forces had a hard time containing the onslaught of the Filipino revolutionaries led by General Emilio Aguinaldo when the Filipino-American War flared up in Luzon and some parts of the Visayas. The Americans feared any strategic or tactical tie-up between the northern insurgents and the southern warriors. Such an eventuality would have been too hot to handle, even for the best of the American generals. Even President William McKinley had entertained serious skepticism over the sovereignty of Spain over the Moro country, particularly the Sulu Sultanate.
So after the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1898, American policy in the Philippines was actually focused on containing the resistance in Luzon. It was their problem that the resistance in the southern part of the country, in Mindanao, especially among Muslims, the Sultanate of Sulu, the Sultanate of Maguindanao, and the royal houses in Lanao, were also generating so much esteem that the American authorities in the country made problem out of it. So in 1899, as a ploy, America started to negotiate treaties with the Sultanate of Sulu. The exchange between the Sultanate of Sulu in their proposals during the negotiation were finally reduced into a single document called the Bates Treaty of 1899.
When the Americans came first, they tried to extract a treaty from the Sultan of Sulu, and this is the infamous Kiram-Bates Treaty. And it extracted like an agreement with the Sultan. But the Bates Treaty, the Kiram-Bates Treaty, had two versions. One is what the Sultan thought to be the original version, which was written in Arabic text in the Tausug language. And this was translated into English with the English text also. So that the Kiram-Bates Treaty was not actually ratified in U.S. Congress. And maybe because one of the reasons was because the two versions did not coincide with each other. There was some variation in the translation. So the American government also thought that maybe they thought that it's not useful because the translation does not jive with the one that was written in the Arabic text and Tausug language. But all the while, the Sultan of Sulu thought that the Kiram Bates Treaty was standing.
Beyond any tint of doubt, the United States did not come to the Philippines in 1898 for the islands of Luzon and Visayas alone, but to claim more territories. Fired by imperialist agenda, her intention to include the Moro country was never doubtful. However, the war with the Northerners was still raging, and any mishandling of the Moros could be disastrous. Even a sort of treaty was in order, and therefore, as earlier said, the signing of the Kiram Bates Treaty, more than any other reasons, was a dilatory tactic to neutralize the Moros while the pacification campaign in the northern areas was still underway. Consequently, the shift from non-interference to direct rule shaped up with the creation of the Moro province. The main reason given for the change of approach from non-interference to direct intervention with the creation of the Moro province was to prepare the Moros for integration into the body politics of the colonial government.
The Bates Treaty of 1899 provided, among others, for the following: number one, mutual respect between the U.S. and the Sultanate of Sulu over the Moro autonomy. Moro autonomy. And second, that the United States of America will not or shall not give or sell out any portion of the Sultanate of Sulu to any nation. And that, as required or demanded by the Sultan of Sulu, the continuing compensation, which was also one of the concessions they got from Spain when they signed the 1878 Treaty of Peace, will have to be continued. So these were the main features of the Bates Treaty.
In May 1899, American troops landed in Jolo. On October 30, the military district of Mindanao, Jolo and Palawan was constituted. On November 16, Zamboanga was occupied. On December 1899 to January 1900, the southern coasts of Mindanao, including Cotabato, Davao, Mati, Parang, Polyok, Banganga, were garrisoned. As more troops poured in, an offshoot of the end of the Filipino-American War in 1901, friction started to occur between the Moros and the Americans.
As far as America was concerned, the Bates Treaty was not actually a treaty itself, because later on in 1904, it abrogated the treaty, saying that it was a mere executive agreement or a modus vivendi, only to buy time because there was resistance in Luzon. And now that in 1904, resistance has already been overcome in Luzon, and they have already established their own government in Luzon, it was already time for them to disown the treaty, the Bates Treaty, with the Sultanate of Sulu, with the Sultan of Sulu.
On March 2, 1904, they did exactly what they were expected to do. President Theodore Roosevelt, without the slightest conjunction or any moral or ethic consideration, unilaterally declared the treaty null and void. In essence, the U.S. policy in relation with the Moros was in line with the treatment of the American Indians, whereby agreements made with them were set aside as convenience dictated. These agreements carried no weight and no binding effects on the Americans on the malicious pretext that the Moros, like the Red Indians, were savages. The Kiram Bates Treaty had practically ceased to exist already when the Moro province was created on June 1st, 1903. The Moro province was under the direct supervision of the civil governor of the Philippine Islands and the Philippine Commission, similar to the present autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao of today. The creation of the Moro province was deemed the transitional machinery for the shift from the military to civil rule in the Moro territory. The first governor of the Moro province was Major General Leonard Wood. As governor of the province, he adopted the mailed fist policy, or simply the use of brute force, to quell even a minor military problem. His background, either as military man or political leader, was far from desirable. As officer of the Rough Riders Regiment, he first saw action against the Indians and then against the Spaniards in Cuba in 1898. In his characteristic arrogant ways, he bluntly told the Sulu Sultan on the eve of the abrogation of the treaty,
I want to be very frank with you here. At present, your rights as a nation, nothing. We will be here forever, I believe, unless a greater country comes and drives us away. We don't know of such country.
November 1909. Brigadier General John C. Pershing took over as governor of the Moro province and lasted up to December 15, 1913, when the Department of Mindanao and Sulu was created. Like General Wood, he was a veteran of the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War, and later in Mexico against Pancho Villa. A year after his stint in Mindanao, he was appointed commander of the World War I American Expeditionary Force in Europe. During his term as head of the Moro province, he was responsible for the creation of the first Christian colony of settlers in Mindanao in 1912. Although he continued the educational programs of his predecessors, it was under him that the number of Moro children increased. However, disarmament of the Moros was his major achievement. Under him, the province greatly progressed, particularly in ways of the American system of governance, which eventually led to the appointment of the first civilian rule in Mindanao and Sulu. In 1916, the legislative power over the Moro country was transferred to the Philippine legislature as per stipulated in the Jones Law. In 1920, the control of the Moro affairs, except for a few positions held by Americans, was in the hands of non-Muslim Filipinos. On February 5, 1920, the Department of Mindanao and Sulu was formally abolished by an Act number 2878 of the Philippine legislature. Instead, the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes was organized. Teofisto Gingona Sr., a native Christian, succeeded as head of the office. In 1936, a further change was effected with the renaming of this office into the Commission on Mindanao and Sulu, with Dansalan, now Marawi City, as its headquarters. As early as May 1899, despite the Kiram-Bates Treaty, trouble already erupted in Mindanao and Sulu. The main reason was that the next-level chiefs, after seeing that the sultans were giving in too much to the dictates of the Americans, started to assert themselves. Very soon, serious military confrontations flared up in various parts of the Moro country.
The Sultan of Sulu failed, as alleged in the cable, failed to deliver his obligations under the treaty. Referring, of course, to the continuing resistance coming from the people, because the people didn't really want to be under the jurisdiction or sovereignty of the United States of America.
These events led one American writer, Joseph Ralston Hayden, to comment that never during the entire continental expansion of the United States had armed encounters been frequent and serious as that between the Moros and the American troops. The Moros' bold display of heroism, bravery, and determination, even against formidable odds, spoke of their undying spirits to fight for their religion, people, and lands. The living legacy to this was the invention of the 1911 .45 caliber pistol, which was specially designed by John Browning to stop the highly moral Moro fighters. As early as April 1902, a large-scale engagement occurred in Bayang, Lanao del Sur. About 1,200 American troops were thrown into action against the 600 warriors of the Sultan of Bayang and of nearby settlements.
إذ يوحي ربك إلى الملائكة أني معكم فثبتوا الذين آمنوا سألقي في قلوب الذين كفروا الرعب فاضربوا فوق الأعناق واضربوا منهم كل بنان.
In 1903, led by Panglima Hassan in alliance with many minor datus, confronted the Americans. With about 400 followers, including women and children, he assaulted the American troops stationed in Jolo. The struggle of Panglima Hassan was short-lived. On March 4th, 1904, he was martyred at his hideout during the Battle of Bud Bagsak. But the Americans found in him a ferocious fighter who never hesitated to throw himself in battle, even to drive out the Americans. The first battle of Bud Daho, also known as the Battle of Mount Daho, was a counterinsurgency action fought by American soldiers against Moros in March 1906. While fighting was limited to the ground action on Jolo Island in the Sulu archipelago, use of naval gunfire contributed significantly to the overwhelming firepower brought to bear against the insurgents, who were mostly armed with melee weapons. The description of the engagement as a battle is disputed because of the overwhelming firepower of the attackers and the lopsided casualties. The conflict, especially the final phase of the battle, is also known as the Moro Crater Massacre.
Very inhuman treatment against the natives. But from the perspective of our people, from the perspective of our grandfathers and aunties and great-grandfathers, that incident was with willingness from our people. It was parang sabil. You do not engage in parang sabil if you are not pure, if you are not really convinced that you are going to do it. Because fear will come in. When you hear the cannons, you hear the firearms of the Americans, there will be fear, and you should not run away from it. That is the concept of parang sabil to the Tausus. So that after that, the Sultan in Maimbung was already alarmed because more than 700 people were killed in that mountain. I am a direct descendant. My great-grandfather, Jalalain, and his wife was one of those who climbed Bud Talipao, the mountain of Bud Talipao, and called the other relatives and some more people from the islands, including from the island of Pata, to join them in the last parang sabil against the American people. So it is very sentimental when it's narrated to us because for a whole week, they climbed the mountain, they stayed there, they were reading the Quran, and they were also playing the kulintangan and the agong. We have a cave in the mountain Talipao. So the Americans started to attack them. And there were those who survived. My auntie told me that one of a young female baby was actually thrown out of the fence. They created a fence so that they cannot run out, and they tied down their feet to the ground so that they cannot run. They intentionally wanted to die in that mountain rather than being Christianized. That's how they think, being Christianized by this new rulers who are coming in to the Sulu archipelago.
The extent of the ferocity of combat and the distraught condition of the American occupation forces could be reflected in one of the most favorite expressions. The only good Moro is a dead Moro. No less than 20,000 Moros were killed in actions from 1899 to 1916. From 1904 to the end of General Wood's term as governor of the Moro province in 1906, the Moros suffered 3,000 dead against 70 Americans. The Americans continued to govern the Moros with an iron fist, suppressing any resistance with a superior force. While American bureaucrats occupied key government institutions, gradually they were replaced by Christian Filipinos with a so-called Filipinization of the country, which the Moros interpreted as Christianization. The Moros, on the other hand, were excluded from the decision-making processes of the government. When the idea of a Philippine Republic began to surface, Moro leaders petitioned the American colonial government protesting their inclusion to the new republic. This culminated in the petition to the President of the United States of America from the people of the Sulu archipelago in 1921, the Zamboanga Declaration of 1924, the Dansalan Declaration of 1935, and many others.
Actually, it's the same because although earlier than the Zamboanga Declaration, there was still a petition of the Datus of Sulu earlier. And what is common in all these political documents is the desire of the Bangsamoro to be free. Ang Zamboanga Declaration is more pragmatic in the sense that, okay, kung hindi man pwede na, kung nisasalin nyo kami sa Pilipinas, then after 50 years, dapat bigyan kami nyo ng karapatan to decide for ourselves na to become still retain to be part of the Philippines, or to be independent, or even to be part of the United States.
In the Zamboanga Declaration, the Moro Datus, led by Sultan Mangingin of Maguindanao, demanded that, in the event that the United States grants independence to the Philippine Islands without provision for our retention under the American flag, it is our firm intention and resolve to declare ourselves an independent constitutional sultanate to be known to the world as Moro Nation. It must be emphasized that in this particular document the term Moro Nation was used by the signatories, which if you translate into Bahasa Malayo becomes Bangsamoro.
Dansalan petition of 1934. This was the expression ng sentimento ng mga Muslim religious scholars dun sa fear nila na eventually kung may gagawin na constitution or kung ibibigay magkakaroon ng independence at masasali sila, dapat guaranteed sa constitution na preserve, protected ang Islam. Walang mati-change sa Islam. In fact, 14 times na na-mention dun sa petition ng ang Islam. Okay, ang Islam. Sino mga signatories nito? Sino nag-sign nito? More than 230 Muslim scholars, religious people in Lanao. Mga imams, mga ulama, mga sheikhs, masyaikh, mga sultans, datus,